Okay guys, here's the first of the videos that I promised for Chapter 13, Criminal Law and Procedure. It will be in 15-minute increments because that's what it takes in order to upload the videos. I can't make them too big, so that way you can watch a little bit at a time. Okay, so the next clarification I want to make is that you will take another course in criminal law and procedure with Miss Murray, and in that course you will look at specific Georgia statutes, Georgia law. This particular review of Chapter 13 is much more broad because here we're talking about covering in one class period in one chapter what you will spend an entire semester on. So we're looking at it from a much broader picture. Okay, so let's talk about, hold on one second, my PowerPoint is not advancing, so let me pause and see if I can correct that. Okay, so I think I've got it back working. Let's first talk about the attorneys that are involved in criminal cases, because as a paralegal you could possibly be working for either side. So crimes are prosecuted by public prosecutors who are employed by that particular government. Okay, in a federal case, the chief or the top public prosecutor is the U.S. Attorney. Okay, and then, but most of the trials that happen are tried by those assistant U.S. attorneys. Okay, so if you're looking in state cases, it can really depend on the state and or the particular county or jurisdiction circuit as to what they call the prosecutor. It could be the DA, the district attorney, and then that DA's assistant district attorneys, ADAs. It could be called the Solicitor General. It could just be the prosecutor. It really depends on the particular jurisdiction that you're in. And then if you work on the other side for criminal defense, there's some multiple opportunities there as well. You've got your criminal defense attorneys. Usually criminal defendants are going to hire a private attorney to defend them. That's assuming that they have funds. If they can't afford to hire an attorney, then the court will appoint an attorney to represent that defendant. Those are your public defenders. And of all of the scenarios I've talked about, there's paralegals working in each of those. So there's opportunities on both sides depending upon what interests you in criminal defense work or criminal prosecution. Okay, so our next step is to talk about, well, what is a crime? Okay, everything we've talked about previously has dealt with civil law. Okay, last 2 or 3 classes we've really focused on the procedure for taking a case through the civil court. Now we're going to look at that through the criminal law lens. Okay, so we talked about the fact that a criminal a civil case deals with when you have injured a particular person. Let's say that we're in a car accident and one of the drivers sues the other driver. That's civil law. Okay. Now we're talking about crimes that are, a crime is seen as an offense against the whole society. Okay. Criminal defendants are prosecuted by that public official that we discussed on the previous slide, whether we call them a district attorney, a solicitor general, a U.S. attorney. It just depends on what jurisdiction that you are in. And those who have committed a crime are subject to the possibility of several penalties. It could be fines, it could be jail, clearly in some states it could be the death penalty. So there are many penalties that could be enforced against that defendant, should that criminal defendant, should they be found guilty. Okay, most, and I would say 99.9% of the laws that exist with regard to criminal law are statutory laws. They come from statutes, and the legislature is who dictates what is a crime. Okay, so in the state of Georgia, if it is a state statute, that's been created and passed by the state legislature. If we're dealing with a federal crime, then it has been defined by the United States Congress. Okay, we've also spent some time talking about standards of proof previously. In a criminal case, that standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. We've talked about the difference between beyond a reasonable doubt and preponderance of evidence, and then that middle burden of proof of clear and convincing evidence. But now we're just going to focus on beyond a reasonable doubt. The state has, pretty extensive resources, although most prosecutors are, limited by their budgets, which limits those cases that they can actually prosecute. But in comparison to the defendant, they have much more resources at their disposal. So it becomes important to make sure that the rights of the defendant are protected. Okay, and we'll talk some more about that later in one of the other videos for this chapter. Another thing I want to talk about are victimless crimes. Sometimes a criminal act doesn't necessarily involve an actual victim. Okay, and those are what are called victimless crimes. A criminal act is that violation of a rule of society that's been enacted into law by elected representatives of the people. So even if we don't have a particular victim who has been hurt by this criminal defendant, it can be that society as a whole has been hurt. Okay? So this chart does a comparison from civil versus criminal law, talking about, what's the act, the wrongful act that we're talking about, and who's the party that brings the suit, and what's the standard of proof, and what is the remedy? And you could take a look at this, but we'll talk more about the remedies in a minute. We've talked previously about the fact that someone could be subject to both civil and criminal liability, and the example that stands out in most people's mind is O.J. Simpson, who is found innocent in a criminal case and found liable in a civil case. So one act could produce trials in both criminal and civil court. So let's talk some about those classifications of crimes. Here we're talking about felonies, which are clearly serious crimes, anything that can be punished by imprisonment for more than 1 year. If it is less than 1 year, then it is going to be classified as a misdemeanor. Now, there are levels within each of those, but they depend on your particular jurisdiction. Okay, as we said before, most crimes are defined in the state statutes, and states have jurisdiction over any cases that involve those crimes. Federal jurisdiction does apply to many crimes. If there was some federal law that has defined a particular action as a crime, then federal jurisdiction exists. Usually, federal criminal jurisdiction applies to crimes that happen outside of the jurisdiction of a particular state. And keep in mind, when we say outside of a jurisdiction, that we're not necessarily talking about geography as we might be, subject matter. If it involves interstate commerce or interstate communications, if it interferes with the operation of a federal governmental agency or the federal government in general, or it's directed at citizens or property located outside of the United States. And then we have those crimes that are categorized as petty offenses. Here we're talking about traffic offenses. And one of the examples they give you in your text are building code violations. Those are considered to be petty offenses. Okay, in the next video, we'll begin to talk about the elements of criminal liability and the actual pieces of a criminal action.